So hello, good morning to all of you. It's very good to see several familiar faces here, but mostly let me thank the European Commission for the invitation. Let me also thank the Finnish government for the opportunity to be here. The main purpose of my presentation will be a little bit to share with you the OECD thinking, the OECD work in the areas of data-driven public sector, and precisely having in mind the topic of this conference, connecting this issue of data-driven public sector to the citizens. So I don't need to convince the audience here about the digital transformation on the way, about how emerging technologies are changing the way that we live, that we work, that we cooperate. And for that, and in this kind of context and environment, you really need what we call a digital government. So government is not out of the change underway. Government is in fact a fundamental part of this process. And as we've been discussing for a lot of years in forums like the OECD, the European Commission, the United Nations, so within international cooperation. So more than trying to digitize what was previously analog, what we need today is really what we call a digital government. And it's not a question of the concept. We can call it digital government. We can call it probably in a few days another different thing. But what makes difference the time that we have today and this concept of digital government as we name it is, on the one hand, the need of thinking technology from start, trying to have what we call a digital by design approach. So you need to think technologies from the beginning, the potential of digital technologies when you start designing your services, your process, and you also need to do it with your citizens, with your ecosystem. So you need to bring this ecosystem on board to make sure that you mitigate the risks of not delivering as you should in this area. So we've been in the OECD, we've been working a lot in this area, and we've reached out with our leaders community, meaning the community of CIOs of the public sector, from members and non-member countries. We've reached out to the 6 dimensions of a digital government. So I would say each one of those words here are very familiar to you. Government as a platform, open by default, digital by design, user-driven approaches. So the words are not new. What can be, let's say, innovative in some way is how you bring all these concepts together, how you are able to relate them, and how you are actually able to implement them in your policy making process. So, for instance, issues of I already mentioned to you digital by design, but if we focus on proactive service delivery, so how governments are capable, probably in using here the word that was mentioned by Gertrude, how can governments anticipate citizens' needs, become more and more invisible governments, and provide services in advance. And of course, all of this is linked with the use of data. All of this is linked with the capacity of understanding user needs, of bringing them on board and making them part of the process, making sure that your policies are aligned with citizens, but also as a mechanism to share to share ownership, to share responsibility with your ecosystem of stakeholders. Let's focus here on one of the 6 dimensions, that is precisely a data-driven public sector. So it starts, the DPS, as we call it, it starts with recognizing data as a key asset for government. So we've been all hearing the expression as data is the new oil, data is the new asset. So we need to go from thinking about this or expressing this kind of feelings to really some policy actions and in this area. And mostly trying to connect, also using an expression here, trying to connect the dots. We know this is not, when we talk about several dimensions of data, open government, sharing data in the public sector, data analytics, we need to see it as a full and coherent ecosystem that has its own dynamics, its own reasons. And you need to do it also, and when you develop this kind of data-driven approach, always focused on design, on the delivery of services, and also on the monitoring capacities that this can bring to the organization. As I look here to the audience, of course it's fantastic to mention all this kind of possibilities, but each one of us also knows the big challenges that we face when we try to implement this kind of approach in the administration. Different countries have different experience here, but when we look at issues like legacy, so how to overcome this kind of issues, but also not only in terms of technical legacy, but also what we call cultural legacy, or how to reach a digital transformation mindset in your administration, how to make sure that data is really perceived as an asset in your administration. It's perceived as a fundamental element by your policy stakeholders. So this is a full work that we need to undertake, but mostly trying to make sure that this work is connected. Last week we were in Slovenia working on a digital government review, and we're precisely discussing this. So how can we make sure that this concept of digital government, the concept of data-driven public sector, reaches and is able to make a click in the policymakers that are not from this area, that sometimes still understand data issues as a technical issue, not really being able to connect it with the real transformation of the administration. So it's all this work that we need to do, overcoming fragmented efforts in the administration, also trying to tackle issues that are big in most of the OECD countries, and we believe also in the European Union member states, about skills and how to have the proper data skills in this area. But I would like to underline mostly the question of the leadership. That is, the deep understanding of data, not as a detail, not as a trendy word that we like to use in conferences somewhere, but really something that we need to work with and we need to focus as we develop more and more our administration. For that, good data governance is absolutely fundamental. And when we mention good data governance, we mean a full set of issues that need to be covered when you develop a policy in this area, covered, addressed, implemented each day, monitored also, to make sure that a data-driven public sector is developed. So what we also developed in the OECD together with our member countries is this framework for public sector data governance that tries to reflect this vision of coherence and of integration of several dimensions that you need to really consider in your policy to make sure that the data-driven public sector is in place. So you need to connect issues of leadership and vision. And leadership and vision means really have a clear idea about the benefits of data. Where do you want to go? What are your goals? Reflect in your programmatic documents. There are issues of capacity to implement, coordination across the public sector, making sure that this policy area is not an area of a specific institution in the public sector, but it's something of the whole public sector. led by one institution, led by political stakeholders, but it's a totally cross-cutting policy. Issues of regulation, I could spend hours talking about this, and several others that we mentioned there. Data infrastructure, data architecture, so it's this full framework that you need to have in place in your policy, in your policies, to make sure that data can be seized as it should. When we also discuss the benefits of data, we're also mentioning that sometimes it's not easy to push and to press that lever that is showing the relevance of this topic in the public sector. We use here and try to show the benefits of data, mostly focus on these three areas that I'm showing right now in this slide. That is, data is the correct management of data. A data-driven public sector is fundamental on one hand to develop what we call anticipatory governance. So, as it was mentioned, to enable your public sector to develop proper foresights based on the experience that you have underway. It's fundamental for the design and delivery of processes and services. So with the proper use of data, having on top emerging technologies, like it was mentioned in the previous presentation of the European Court of Auditors, is fundamental. But using namely emerging technologies to take the full benefit of this data to provide personalized service tailored to citizens' needs, more and more convenient, and applying principles that we all know as the once-only principle. Data is also fundamental, and probably this is the dimension that is more mature in most OECD countries in terms of performance management. So knowing what is happening, learning from them, and mostly creating what we call feedback loops in your policy process based on data. But it's also fundamental, and now I'm clearly linking the presentation also with the topic of this conference, to create public trust, because we know that more and more the use of data it has a lot of potential, but the risks are also high. I don't need to provide you examples about what the last years showed us in terms of risks of management of data from citizens, data from the public sector, and how you need to make sure that that you manage it properly. So there are issues of data ethics that need to be secured, issues of privacy, transparency, consent models. So the requirement of your citizens to know that if your administration is using their data, they need to consent about that kind of use, and we have several examples in the European context where these consent models happen, and also issues of security. We've been working on the topic of ethics. We've been working within OECD leaders thematic group on data-driven public sector that is led by the government of the Netherlands, working on ethic principles of data. So how to use data in an ethical way, and we assume this as a fundamental dimension. Also linked to the issue of using data and making sure that is user driven. We've been noticing more and more that if you want to push for this area at national level, at regional level, the concept of digital rights, it's more and more fundamental. So you need to also push it not only or mostly not from a top-bottom, from a top-down approach, but considering citizens' digital rights and the rights that should be in place when you develop your digital government strategy. So we are developing more and more in our reviews and discussing with the OECD member countries this concept of first, second, and third generation digital rights. The framework or the diagram that I present here, it's still work underway. It was applied already in some reviews, namely in the Digital Government Review of Panama, but tries to show here what are, and based also on the level of digital maturity of the country, what are the first generation digital rights of a country? So what are the things that need to be in place as fundamentals? And here you have here the right that European countries have been addressing during the last, let's say, 20 years, communicate digitally with your public sector, personal data protection, cybersecurity. So there are some fundamentals that need to be in place. Then, if you talk about second generation digital rights, and I would say it's where most, on average, most OECD countries are placed, you start having good policy in place in terms of digital identity, one-stop shops, and the capacity of the citizen to communicate to one-stop shops, multi-channel, transparency, rights, open data, open source. So all concepts that you are familiar and that we've been discussing for a long time. But we also have issues, and that is, I think, where most countries, OECD countries, are looking right now as a goal: third generation digital rights. And here we talk about the concrete application of the once only principle, and we know how difficult this is to apply it throughout the public sector. We touch on issues of proactive service delivery, and assuming this as a citizen right, transparent use of data or consent, as I mentioned, in an ethical way, as also an important issue. The use of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, and making sure that the citizen, if that's the case, is informed about the use of these technologies when important issues are addressed for its life. So it's a framework that we are developing more and more, and that we are more than happy to discuss. So trying to not repeat, good data governance is the combination of all this of this dimension and the capacity to see it in a holistic way. And those of you that have been working more closely with the OECD during the last years in digital government reviews, in the leaders meeting and others, we know that when we mention this kind of coordination, it's not just putting some concepts over there. That's the kind of issue that we really look at in terms of digital government maturity. I can also tell you, and looking here, and it's good to be in this conference, that cooperation between the OECD and the European Union is underway, namely with the European Commission, namely with our host, the DGIT, and from our side, there's a big willingness to explore more and more of this cooperation. And I'm just giving you a little bit a taste of some of the areas that you might hear from us in terms of cooperation with DGIT in the future. So cross-border service delivery involving OECD non-European countries. So that's one of the things that we've been exploring, and also the use of emerging technology in the public sector, following the close participation that the Commission had in our thematic group focused on AI and blockchain in the public sector. So this is it. Thanks a lot again for your attention. Bye.